Now, a few key supply chain stages look like this. There's the raw material production, then the fiber creation, the yarn production, the fabric, then the cutting and sewing and the apparel creation, and finally going to the warehouse. Now, getting this full transparency means knowing where each of the stages is, where you're producing from, so all the way from the raw material until your warehouse, who your suppliers are at each of these stages, and what their major production processes are, as well as how the materials are transported between each of these stages. Now, once you've laid this all out, the next step is to identify your biggest impacts. So, what are the major environmental issues at each of these stages? Is it the amount of water that's used? Is it the amount of energy that's required? Or the type of energy, the source of the energy that's being used here? Is it the chemicals that are used? Or is it the waste that is being produced at this stage? Now, I understand that this might seem like a giant task ahead, but remember, you don't have to spot every single detail of every process, just the main issues behind each stage. Once you've identified the biggest culprit at each stage, you realize that there are a lot of various impacts throughout the full supply chain. And as it's quite impossible to fix all of them at the exact same time, it's very important to focus on the issues that cause the most environmental problems, so-called your material issues, and also focus on the ones that are feasible for your brand to tackle first. Now, let's walk through the supply chain together and look at some of the main issues and also some sustainable alternatives. So, some crucial stages to consider when looking at the impacts are the following. Even before your supply chain comes the product design. Afterwards, there's your raw materials, there's the yarn and fabric creation, the dye house, of course, the apparel production at the cut and sew facility, and your modes of transport. So, sustainability starts even before the supply chain. And one crucial aspect as a business is looking at the product design. The design can actually cause issues or benefits for stages in your supply chain, but it also transcends that to your customers and also the product's end-of-life stage. The main issues in design are products that are created only for trends, they're poor quality, and they have a lot of different materials blended together so that they can't be recycled when they're disposed of. Now, our goal here is to move design away from fast fashion. And that means designing products for multiple occasions and that can be used throughout the year, making products that are made to last and that won't just be thrown away after a couple of seasons, designing products to create less waste at the cut and sew stage, and when possible, try to create garments that don't need to be dry cleaned, as this adds extra impact at the customer's end. As well, creating garments which are made to be recycled afterwards. And this means not blending in too many fibers together, especially elastane. So now, let's jump to the first stage of the supply chain, which is the raw materials. Now, depending on the product, depending on the material that you use at this stage, there will be very different impacts along your supply chain, and it all starts at the raw material stage. Conventional materials are very impactful at this stage. Cotton, for example, is an extremely thirsty crop that requires about 2,100 liters of water to make 1 kilogram of fabric. And that makes 99% of its water impact at this stage of the supply chain. It also uses about 25% of all of its energy in the supply chain at this stage. Polyester, on the other hand, requires petroleum to be extracted, and turning this into granulate chips takes about 30% of the total energy use in the supply chains. Switching to preferred fibers here is the easiest way to avoid these impacts. We will do a deep dive into sustainable materials in the second half of this presentation, so hold on tight. However, if this is not possible for you to switch materials, You can speak with your suppliers at this stage to implement rainwater harvesting programs to move away from irrigation and use more energy efficient cultivation machinery. So, I want to stop here for a second and talk about the importance of energy grids. Depending on what country you produce in, will have very different impacts because of the source of the energy grids. If you're producing in a country like China or India, your CO2 emissions will be higher because they're based on fossil fuels. This can be up from anywhere between 2 to 3 times the amount of emissions compared to grids based on natural gas. The best alternative here is to switch to production in countries that are based on cleaner energy grids. Europe is a great alternative for that, as there's quite a bit of production in Turkey and Portugal, which is a good alternative, and North America as well. So while Canada and the United States don't have much production for knitting and weaving, Mexico would be a great alternative here. But if it's not possible for you to switch, or you're already working with amazing suppliers in these countries, talk with your suppliers or look for suppliers who are using renewable energy, and they're not just based on the country's energy grid. Also, look into keeping equipment up to date and efficient, and running on electricity, not diesel, as this will save on emissions. As well, use knitting rather than weaving. Knitting actually requires far less energy than weaving for both the yarn and the fabric production. All right, so now let's turn to dyeing. This is often the most impactful stage of the supply chain, and there are 3 main problems at this stage. Firstly, it uses a lot of water for dyeing the fabrics, but as well as for cleaning the machines. Secondly, there's a lot of water pollution if there's no recycling system put into place here. And it takes a lot of energy, not just from the actual production, but also from the manufacturing of the dyes and the chemicals, the heating, the drying, as well as the treatment of the wastewater. But there are some great alternatives, so why don't we start with the easiest ones to implement? Firstly, avoid dyeing altogether. This is especially great for cotton and organic cotton that can be grown in a variety of colors, including tan, green, red, brown, as well as yellow. And these aren't genetically modified. Also, avoid using dark colors in general, as these are generally more focused on dye chemicals and need more water. And colors to avoid here are turquoise, bright blues, Kelly greens, as these also require heavy metals. As well, go away from azo dyes that are used in about 70% of the commercial dyes on the market today. And they're used because they're cheap and they have very strong colors. But these dyes are also incredibly harmful for human health as well as the environment. Rather, switch to low-impact reactive dyes. These are free from toxic chemicals and heavy metals and require less rinsing and less water usage. Or switch to natural dyes. These are obtained from natural sources, which are mostly from plants, but also come from other sources such as insects, shellfish, and mineral compounds. So these natural dyes are also resilient to fading and are now becoming more readily available on the market. Also, check for Also check for your facility processes. So aim to reduce your dye baths for several batches, or try to reduce your liquor ratios when possible. And currently on the market, we have a standard liquor ratio of about 12 to 1. That means that there's 12 liters needed for 1 kilogram. So reducing this ratio will save a lot of water in the long term. Also, check for the location of the dye house. Is the water being withdrawn from the groundwater or from surface water? Is the dye here being taken, or is the dye house being located in water scarce regions that too much surface water is being diverted in places such as India or Bangladesh? And try to work with suppliers who have a water recycling system or a closed loop system rather than needing to extract new water and to use new water for this dyeing. And lastly, look for certifications that you can trust in when choosing suppliers and materials. Some of these are examples such as the Ecotech Standard 100, the Blue Sign, and the GOTS standard, which make sure that there's a certain environmental level standard that is reached. So let's go on to the apparel creation. This is often a stage that can be most influenced because brands work in close proximity with their suppliers, and it's highly dependent on the product design. The main issue at this stage is that there is a lot of waste. So about 37% of fiber is lost throughout the production when creating a t-shirt, and most of it comes at this stage. This means that more fiber actually needs to be produced to make up for this waste. So here are a few ways to be able to reduce this. Firstly, reuse scraps for other items such as jewelry, headbands, and accessories. Also, try to design for minimal blends, as I was talking about before. So try to use less fiber blends in materials, as this is more likely that your scraps are able to be recycled. And of course, this goes in hand with the next point, which is collaborate with recycling facilities in the area to be able to recycle this fiber. So this material can either be recycled in a closed loop system to make new garments, or if the quality is not so good, it can be done through open loop to create furniture, carpets, and other items. And lastly, a crucial step to keep in mind is transportation. So with our global supply chains nowadays, it can't be that each step is done in a different country around the world. You can have cultivation done in the US, sent over to Asia, sent back to Europe, sent to Asia, and back to warehouse in North America. It goes all over the place. And this leads to a lot of unnecessary CO2 emissions. Usually, ship will be used throughout the supply chain, but brands will often also use air between their assembly, their cut and sew, and the warehouse. And this is very impactful. Brands will often use air transport because orders have to arrive very quickly to their warehouse, or for smaller brands, it might be that it's not even possible yet to book a ship container. But air adds about 4 to 5 kilograms of extra CO2 emissions to 1 kilogram of apparel. And that would be about 20 kilograms of CO2. So some main solutions here are using ship instead of air. Ship only adds less than half a kilogram of CO2 to your total footprint. And when possible, use train instead of truck for inland transportation when possible. Now, I understand that sometimes it might not be possible for a brand to use ship versus air. But then try having your assembly geographically closer to your warehouse as a good alternative. This is particularly important if you're a smaller brand and can't yet book container ships. And also try to have as much of your supply chain as close as possible to your warehouse to avoid unnecessary worldwide travel. And lastly, work with suppliers that have vertically integrated facilities. This is when multiple processes of the supply chain are done inside one facility. If this is not possible, at least aim to have production done in the same country or neighboring countries. So, to quickly recap what we've learned so far, in implementing these sustainable practices throughout your supply chains, the most impactful actions that you can take are 1, to create clothing that goes away from fast fashion. 2, use ship and train whenever possible. And 3, and often the easiest step, is to switch over to sustainable fibers.